Starting a vegetable garden or growing space always involves disrupting what is currently on the ground and somehow transforming it into a productive space for vegetables. This can be a relatively easy task if you're starting with a flat lawn or a clean meadow that has deep fertile soil and is clear of debris and perennial weeds. But in many cases, especially in an urban context, we're looking at an uneven site with difficult access, overgrown with pernicious weeds, and aren't entirely certain what lies beneath the surface of the soil or even hidden among the vegetation. This is what I faced with a 150 square meter section of the black plot that I wanted to establish as a growing space, which had been the site of a former polytunnels that had been destroyed in a storm a number of years ago. The site had been abandoned, leaving plastic from the edges of the polytunnel still buried in the ground, and the site was very uneven with remnants of raised beds and piles of soil, compost, and stones. In addition, the north end of the space was cleared to build a compost demonstration facility, and all the topsoil and vegetation had been left in a large pile on part of the space that I wanted to clear. Over the last few years, this area had been invaded by some fairly pernicious weeds, including scotchgrass, creeping thistle, and a lot of nettles and other perennial weeds. But this site has a lot of potential, and with all of the plans for the area, this site will eventually become a sheltered high-value growing space, which I see as a zone 1 or 2 within the permaculture zoning for the site. I plan to lay out this space in a series of fixed beds for high-rotation crops and seed saving, variety trials, and a lot of other explorations. But first I needed to figure out how to transform this really messy site into a clean and productive growing space. The use of a broad-spectrum herbicide to kill off the existing vegetation on this site was not an option, and because of the constraints of the site and the uneven ground, it would have been difficult to get in a tractor to plow or till the soil, and I decided against getting in a backhoe or digger to do the heavy work. I felt that using a rototiller to do the job would be quite problematic, as the uneven site and the buried plastic and stones would make it a really tough task, and I didn't want to chop up and distribute all of the scotchgrass roots. I had contemplated bringing in a few pigs for the summer to get them to do their natural thing and to till up all the soil, but I don't think I'm ready for the additional tasks and responsibilities of being a pig owner. So it seemed that I was going to have to do most of the hard work myself, which I don't mind too much and have done a lot of it in the past. The simplest way would be to methodically dig over the whole area, removing as much of the weeds, plastic debris, and larger stones as I could in the process, which would have involved a lot of bending to collect the material by hand. I had used an adaptation of the lazy bed method to establish fixed beds in another larger section of the black plot a few seasons ago, which involved cutting out clumps of sod and turning them over to bury them under the growing bed. This was a reasonable option in the flatter areas of the plot, but I don't think it would have been as successful in this rougher section of the site, and there had still been a lot of work to get rid of the pernicious weeds in the following seasons. I had also used a method of simply turning over the clumps of sod, leveling the soil a bit, and then covering the surface with a ground cover fabric, which had worked fairly well in a really rough section that I had then planted with squash. I had also used a variation of this method to establish my new polytunnel last year, where I dug over the ground, leaving most of the weed roots in place, and then covered the entire area with a ground cover fabric. I then planted tomatoes, cucumbers, and other larger plants in holes melted in the ground cover fabric, which allowed me to get the space established quickly enough to get a crop that summer. I could have used some version of this ground cover fabric method to get a crop of larger plants in the first season before establishing better growing beds in the following season, if I was willing to wait another year. As usual, I wish I had started this process a year or two ago, which would have definitely reduced the workload this season and opened up a bunch of other options. There are, of course, a number of no-dig approaches that I could use. If I could get my hands on enough cardboard, straw, spoiled hay, and other materials, I could have covered the entire site with a deep litter mulch, which would have killed off all the weeds and boosted the soil life and fertility in the process. But I've tried this method in other gardens, and I found it to be a bit problematic in this cool and wet climate, especially as the slug population always dramatically increases, making it very hard to grow anything for at least a few seasons. A better no-dig approach for this climate seems to be a method developed by Charles Dowding of covering the cardboard and paper with a thick layer of finished compost. I calculated that I would have needed up to 12 cubic meters or about 15 yards of compost to cover this entire 150 square meter site to a depth of 75 millimeters or 3 inches, which is a huge amount of material or about 120 wheelbarrow loads full, but I think is a minimum I would need to do the job on this rough site. If I had that much compost to spare or could get enough of it locally, I'd consider using this method, but I don't. And clean, good quality compost is hard to get around here, especially at that volume. Another option would be to use a substantial layer of wood chip as a covering, which is often referred to as a back to Eden method. Wood chip is a bit easier to get than compost and cheaper in this area, but I'm not sure if this type of wood chip mulch is compatible with the diversity of types of plants that I want to grow in this section, at least for the first couple of seasons, but I may be wrong about that. All of these no-dig methods would require a substantial amount of work, bringing in and spreading around a large volume of material, none of which I have ready access to and would probably need to pay for. And none of these methods would necessarily resolve the issues of the uneven site and the buried plastic, although I could dig out the plastic and level the site first, but this seems to go against the principles of these methods, or I could work around and adapt to these quirky site characteristics. One possible option that I hadn't thought of before would be to bring in loads of additional topsoil and just raise the entire section of the garden, burying everything including weeds, stone, debris, plastic, and dramatically increasing the depth of the topsoil in the process. It would need to be quite a thick layer of additional soil in order to level the site and prevent the regrowth of the weeds. But if I did the work beforehand to dig out some of the higher sections of the ground and dig out some of the plastic while I'm at it, and then to put the soil on top of a layer of cardboard or paper, this would help to dramatically reduce the amount of soil that is needed. This is a resource that I do have access to for free, as we have a lot of topsoil on site left over from the development phase of the community, and it's located less than 100 meters away from this part of the plot. It does have a fair amount of stones in it as well as weed roots, and would take some additional work to clean it up before I imported it into this part of the plot. I'd need the help of machinery to move that volume of soil if I wasn't up for hauling the 200 to 300 heavy wheelbarrow loads of soil that distance. But methodically digging out and hauling 2 or 3 wheelbarrow loads of topsoil a day over the summer months would have done the job. Because this resource is so close and available, I wish I'd thought about using it before, as I might have taken this option. What I ended up doing is methodically digging and sifting the soil with the help of the rugged compost sieve that I built and adapted. It was a lot of work, but I spread the work out over a few months, and I think I'll end up with the best results with clean and prepared growing beds ready for next season. First, I used my scythe to cut down all the vegetation as close as I could to the ground, which I removed for composting. Then I set up a barrier around the site, and I brought in a bunch of retired hens from a small local egg supplier to help with the task. Using my sharpened spade, I cut sections of soil and weed roots, lifted them onto the sieve, and bashed them around a bit to loosen the soil from the roots. I then manually pick out all the roots and any unwanted debris, and work the stones towards the lower end of the sieve, and all of the soil would fall through the holes in the sieve to the hens waiting below. Each day I would try to cut and sieve 1 or 2 square meters of ground, which would take me about 15 or 20 minutes, depending on the conditions of the soil in that location. This would create a substantial pile of sifted soil, which the hens would methodically dig into looking for worms, grubs, and seeds, which kept them quite happy and supplemented their diet, and I got a lot of eggs. Every few days I would haul a wheelbarrow load of stones to areas where they were useful, and I built up quite a pile of weed roots for hot composting. This labor-intensive process was doing a lot of jobs at once. I was able to really loosen the soil, remove the vast majority of weeds, dig out clusters of larger stones, remove a lot of the smaller stones, clear out all the buried plastic and debris, and feed the hens. What I ended up with is lots of loose, clean soil that is easy to move around and shape into deep, level growing beds, and the lack of stones will make cultivating and hoeing this section of the gardens a lot easier for many years to come. And as a bonus, the full site is already well fertilized with lots of chicken manure. It was a lot of work, possibly taking up to 40 hours in total, but this was spread out over a couple of months. It was a useful task to do, and I learned a fair amount in the process. It was interesting experimenting with changing the slope of the sieve and the particular technique that worked best for the type of root systems that were in the area, or how dry or wet the soil was, and I was surprised at how well it worked when the soil was quite wet. I also found that the sieve could accommodate 3 or 4 people working at the same time, which definitely sped up the process, especially when I was clearing a larger pile of soil. The hens did help, although they were not a necessary part of the process, but the fact that I was feeding them helped me keep at the task of doing it almost every day. They did clear out a lot of the undesirable grubs and weed seeds, but they also ate a lot of the worms, many of which were probably already injured with my digging. This process definitely disturbed the soil ecosystem, but once the fixed beds are made and the compost is added and the paths are covered with wood chip, I plan to use a minimal surface cultivation or even a no-dig method into the future, and no doubt an abundant and healthy soil ecosystem will develop again fairly quickly. Some smaller pieces of scotch grass roots fell through the sieve, and I'll have to make sure that they don't become established again. And of course there will be loads of weed seeds ready to sprout in the spring, but I plan to burn them off with my flame weeder. This option of using a sieve to clear rough ground to establish a garden isn't perfect, but it did a pretty good job in this context. I front-loaded most of the work and all of the soil disturbance, and this site will be much more productive and easy to manage in the future. I like to see it as a process of maximizing effort with the hope of maximizing possible benefit, and occasionally that's the way I like to do things.